To introduce our next speaker, who is Sam Chang. And as she said in her bio, and as she said yesterday, she is an art historian by day and a classical musician by night. She's currently based at the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto, where she does a great deal of teaching, and she's also finishing up her PhD, and she's also a professional flautist and conductor. Now, her research focuses on the relationships between visual art and music in the early modern period, and this presentation she's going to talk about the enormous presence of musicians, musical instruments, and musical elements in 16th and 17th century paintings. So when everyone is settled, Sam will start.
My eyesight, okay, thank you. My eyesight is terrible, so I'm going to assume the screen is okay. I'm an art historian with terrible eyesight. It's a good combination. It's just a PDF, so full screen is sufficient. I mean, almost full screen is good enough as well. There you go. That's lovely. Thank you for all your help, and thank you everyone for being here. Is there text on there? No. All right. Perhaps I'll need all your help during the presentation to tell me where I'm at image-wise, but I figure we should start exactly where we are in this space, this beautiful sculpture park. And yesterday, as we were walking around, one of the things that really struck out to me is there's a real rhythm in how things are mapped out and planned in this space. And so even though I look at early modern art, I definitely felt there was a very clear connection there, thinking about these motifs that were being developed and recapitulated. And this is something that was done in the 16th and 17th centuries as well. Oh, wow, fancy. Now it's real full screen. Being at the sculpture park has made me think about even being in a space such as the Met Cloisters, where you have this rhythmic use of architecture and light. And one thing that really struck out to me the first time I visited the Met Cloisters in New York is there's music everywhere. They play music as you're walking around and looking at the objects. And I think it's Jess, you're working on the soundtrack for the sculpture park, so that really helped me think about that connection. I know, Danielle, I'm really looking forward to your compositions tomorrow as well. And recently, I was just talking to Vanessa about there's this massive exhibition of Vermeer at the Rijksmuseum. If any of you have gone, I need to talk to you. But this is an unmissable feast. Unfortunately, I'll be missing it completely. But even when you're watching the exhibition previews, like the videos, they accompany with music, right? Oftentimes you get like the Richard Strauss, also Sprechzatura, da, da, and you're like, oh, this is very exciting. But what always struck me is that when you actually go to museums and galleries, most of them, there's no music, right? When you're looking at art objects in your own home, there's probably no soundtrack that's involved. Yet, even with Vermeer, I actually love how they chose this as their exhibition image. 3 out of the 10 paintings that they've displayed include musical elements. And this is precisely why I study this period, is that almost 1/3, sometimes up to nearly 60 or 70% of an artist's output would include musical elements. Now, as much as I want you to take you through a journey of music and arts from the medieval to maybe 18th century, I don't have time. I'm sure James will rip the mic away from me. So I'll focus on one element, which is because of Jeffrey Rubinoff, I was thinking about how he was listening to Bach's Mass in B minor as he worked on one of his pieces. And I thought, well, artists have done this throughout time. Painters have done this. Right now we're looking at a photograph of Howard Hodgkins. This is back in 2016, right before his death. This is his final work. And this is a self-portrait, essentially, of himself listening to music as he painted. And this is him looking at this painting. It's very evocative, right? And it has gotten me to think about, well, what are artists listening to in the 16th and 17th century? So that's my entire project, essentially. I look at music inside the painter's studio, and on the screen here, I've given you some examples of painters really conscientiously representing those musical elements. So on the far left, we have Paul Brill from circa 1595, and he's dressed in a very fine attire, playing the lute right before his painting easel. On the right-hand side are a plethora of other paintings. I've only selected a few, but I also want to emphasize women painters. Women painters, if we're talking about, Vanessa, you're talking about like dialogue and, speaking to ancestors, artists really spoke to one another through these conversational pieces through their work. So here we have a string of self-portraits for those who are familiar with Katharina von Hemison, and on top left, we can get into an argument whether this is a self-portrait or not, but we certainly see sort of this conversational lineage of like, here is a woman artist with a polygonal virginal, Anguissola copies it, readapts it with her maid, and then Lavinia Fontana on the right-hand side also presents herself. So once again, you're seeing sort of like this copying of motif, really like redeveloping, recapitulating these ideas. So I want to start from really where does this come from? So around, and I apologize if the lighting is not great, I'm happy to email you on the slide deck. Around 1516, we have self-portraitures, Italian self-portraitures, where they really include what we call an identifier, sort of like your signature. So instead of signing your self-portrait, right in the very foreground on the left-hand side in Franciabiggio's self-portrait, we have a palette. Painters with their brushes and their palette. And if we actually go back to Paul Brill's self-portrait, normally signatures are found probably in one of the corners. What's in the corner? Bottom left, if you can see it. It's a palette, right? In place of a signature, a palette is sitting in its place. Now, looking at Lepoli's self-portrait, which is the gentleman wearing the brownish red robe, he's also got something in the bottom left corner. What the heck is that? By the way, side story, this photograph, Uffizi did not have a color photograph of the self-portrait. I had to like work with them for 1.5 years to get a photographer in to take it. It was like 250 euros, and now they make it public on their website. And so now I include this painting in every single one of my presentation because I'm like so peeved I had to pay that fee. But what is in the bottom left? It almost looks like there's like paint or globs of something. It's a lute. It's the neck of a lute, right at the very corner. So right in the spot where one would often place either their signature or an identifier representing their profession or their identity, Lepoli, instead of putting in a palette, has put in his lute. And he's very well known as a lute player. Vasari notes that Lepoli was very well trained on lute. He enjoyed playing it. So you see him wearing his painter's robe, but accompanied by the lute. And in the upper right corner, I've included Piero di Cosimo's portrait of Sangallo. So Sangallo, an architect, a furniture maker, but instead of presenting him with the tools of architecture, it's a sheet music, it's a score, right? So now we're starting to think about what are you choosing to include in your self-portrait and what does it say about you? And that's my entire research question is, why do painters like to portray themselves as musicians in the 16th and 17th centuries? So if we go back to our Paul Brill, what I started to notice is that not only are they placing these musical elements in these significant places, but they're starting to mirror the tools of their trade. So if you look at the paintbrush sticking through the little hole of the palette, and look at his lute fingering postures. So in the bottom right corner, I include a drawing by Raphael from 1502, talking about these like thumb techniques where one actually puts a thumb over the neck of the lute, over the strings, in order to create these effects. And if you think about sort of like, there's a para motion of sticking your thumb through the palette holes, putting your thumb over the lute, and even if we go dive further deeper, so if you're painting with the brush, so your right hand is creating sort of like choosing the colors, think about the hand over the lute, over the strings, also choosing the notes. right? So there's that really nice parallel, and that's why I've included on the right-hand side. So on the top, you see the palette with your choices of colors, and then the lute on the bottom with your choices of musical notes. Now, I've done the work for you there where I've talked about Paul Brill and the mirroring. So I invite you, in this case, this is Johann von Swiete from the middle of the 16th century. What are some things that are really jumping out at you? Because I can talk about this piece for like an hour. So it's better if you pick out details and I comment on those. Yes, there's walnuts. So there's all of these vanitas elements in there. So thinking about time, right? Like linking right back to the very first paper. It's not just about music and time, but really art and time. What other details is jumping out, or have I purposely highlighted for you? Yes. I used to paint. I never dressed up like that. I used to wear like an old t-shirt. I don't know, Vanessa, you also paint. I don't know what you wear, but not beautiful red tights with like a beret and some feather. And also those white sleeves, that's just a formula for disaster, right? So this idea of elevating oneself, and what's really interesting for me is that we have other painters in the room. So in the corner on the left-hand side, we have someone grinding the pigments, but also another painter. Now those are everyday painters. They wear these drab brown clothing, and they're all looking towards the ingenious, learned painter in the foreground. They're like, whoa, I want to be him, right? But who else is also looking up in the room? Oh, I never noticed that. Yeah, the skull's looking up. Yes, but there's a St. Francis on the easel. Just in case you did not get the note that like the ingenious artist is looking up, they're like, okay, let me like make this even clearer for you. So we have a religious figure who looks like they're praying, they're getting inspiration from God and looking up. Yesterday, if I remember correctly, Karun, did you say something about like getting God out of the studio or something like, yeah, keeping God out of the studio. And here von Swiete is like, no, I gotta emphasize, I was inspired by God. God gave me these gifts. I am very, very well inspired. I have imagination. The feather also could be linked to, if you look at Iconologia by Cesare Ripa, it could be talking about poetic spirit, poetic ingeniousness. So there is no longer a simple formula of music equals to art, music plus art, music minus art, but it's actually think about music, art, and poetry, and you're going like, wait, how did she get there? So let's see if I've set up the slides in the way that, yeah.
I was wondering, like, for me, what I get here is that he's like an artistic polyglot, and he's showing that he's not only a painter, he's a well-rounded, sort of cultured. Yes. Not only can I do that, but I can like stop doing that and like play the lute for a while very well.
You've totally helped me link to the next idea. That is precisely the case. We know for a fact, for example, Rubens always painted and then he'll take breaks and play music. We have Peter von Leyer, who literally will walk back and forth in front of his painting and start playing the flute or violin, then starts painting again and then go right back to it. Da Vinci made sure there was music playing to keep Mona Lisa happy, right? Music was such a critical element in the painter studio, but the thing with painter is that there was always this debate of whether they are this highly intelligent academic individual or if they were more of the manual arts, right? So for the artist, here in this self-portrait, the message I'm getting seems to be like, we not only do we know how to work with our hands, but we are very, very learned. We are a gentleman. We have dressed up. We've got the clothes. We also got all the other little props that really emphasizes that point. And this is all happening around the time when there were debates of, so music as part of the liberal arts education has always been part of the quadrivium. So that's with arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So if we're talking about time and space, oh gosh, let's see if I remember this. Arithmetic is numbers and something, oh bloody. Geometry is numbers in space. Music is numbers in time. Astronomy is numbers in space and time. What the hell is arithmetic? Sorry, I really don't remember. I'll look this up later. But it was also around this time when music was also being linked to a trivium, which is grammar, rhetoric, and logic. grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And because when they're thinking about music, they're thinking about gestures. And this is around the time of the rediscovery of quintillion and all the ideas of oratory and using gestures as a way of convincing folks. So if we're talking about emotions, music inciting emotions and convincing folks, like if you think about the use of music in altarpieces, right? Evoking that emotional response and connection, music acts not only as the mathematical side, but also this emotional, rhetorical, persuasive thing. So being associated with music not only allows you to self-identify someone with having great intellectual judgment, but also being able to persuade, as I am desperately trying to do in this presentation. I want to give you a few more examples to convince you of how prominent this conversation was taking place. It's not as though all the artists got together at a sculpture park and sat around tables and said, okay, this is what we're going to do for our self-portraits. But it does seem that there is something happening. So on the far left, we have Metsu. This painting is now, whereabouts is unknown. But look at what's happening. You have the painter in the background on the left, and the way he's holding his maul stick is exactly in the same angle as the woman, his model, holding the viola da gamba. And right on top of him, behind him, is a violin on the wall. He can join in on this duet. So this also references that whole conversation about music as harmony. In the middle, you've already seen von Swiete. On the left, we have von Mieris. Here you have, on the far right, we have a sculpture staring at the top of the viola da gamba, right? And on the same plane, at the same line, you have a visitor staring at the figure on the easel. I think I actually have a close-up. Oh, yeah, I knew I wasn't going to be using a clicker, so here are yellow circles to point out things I wanted you to look at. But here's a detail. Like, look at that. This is planning at its finest. I am a dork. I love these pieces because you notice so much details. And also on the easel, that painting is of like a shepherdess, not shepherd. So really tying back to the whole idea of like maybe pastoral poetry, rhetoric, etc. What's on the next slide? I also don't know if you've noticed, but in these paintings, sometimes we get the same sculpture that reappears multiple times. So here is young Hercules fighting a snake. So this is another reference to not only the power of art, but thinking about the actual ownership of these props, of these musical instruments in the music studio. We have a lot of inventory records of what painters kept in their studio, which musical instruments were owned, and you'll notice the same pieces showing up time and time again. The reason this sculpture is significant is here, Hercules is actually thought of as a protector of the arts. So young Hercules is sort of defending arts as in like music, art, painting, and poetry, but also it's this referencing of this ability of the artist. This is Hercules. If you're wondering, like, what's that weird posture? Well, della from Rome, right? This is probably one of the most famous postures. So it's this really, really playful and inventive way of having this conversation. What were happening with the woman artists? Well, lots were happening. If we're thinking about mirroring the painter's tool with the musician's instruments, it was also happening amongst women artists. Now, Anguissola, who did this a little bit earlier, separates them and puts one as, self-portrait painting at the easel, the second self-portrait playing at the polygonal virginal. But if you look at them, same outfit, same type of demeanor. But actually, I'll point out a detail momentarily. What I do want to jump to is Lavinia Fontana on the right-hand side from 1577, and here she collapses her two space. So that in the foreground, you see her playing music, but right at the very back on the, sort of like if you're drawing these vanishing points, you would see that they lie on the same orthogonal, and you have the empty canvas, empty easel in the background. And the easel also seems to be popping out of her head, re-emphasizing this idea of this intellectual and learned painter. She's not looking at the music score. She doesn't need it. She herself is enough to create, to be inspired, and to memorize certain things, because painters were known to, were expected to have great memory so that they could recall various things that they could put together in other paintings. I want to point out the details of really listening to painting. So for Anguissola's self-portrait, right next to her right hand, there's a tuning key, right? You can only tune an instrument if you have the intellectual capacity to hear all the nuances and differences, right? Playing an instrument is one thing. Being able to tune under the instrument really speaks to that judgment piece. So if we look at musical treatises at the time and the way they rank musicians, the highest form of musician is not one that can perform, not one that can play, but it's the one that can judge, right? As a practicing musician, I have some slight issue with that type of description. However, I acknowledge what they're trying to drive at. Now, for Lavinia Fontana, she's ingenious. Now, can anyone see what's on her instrument? It's so small. I'm sorry. I should have just given you a lean in. Hold the screen up to you. It's something red and loopy. Is there anything else that's red and loopy in the painting? Yes, and her earring. We can't see that other ear, but she's placed her earring onto the instrument. She's listening to the instrument. She is telling you, like, my ear's right there, smack on the instrument. Isn't that ingenious? I want to end with a recent reinvestigation of self-portraits by Garofalo. This is not the earliest surviving musical self-portrait. The earliest is from the very late 15th century. If you want to look up Master of Frankfurt on Google Arts and Culture, there's a fantastic piece by him. And he, amongst 100 figures, the artist places himself right in the middle, holding a little dulcimer thingies. What do you call these? Dulcimer hammers. Thank you. But the next one after that is by a gentleman named Garofalo. The last time there was a lot of investigation done on these pieces were in the late 90s, and basically the conclusion is we can't really determine which is the real Garofalo, which is the copy. I've solved it. But anyways, that's not the takeaway. But what I wanted us to think about when we're looking at, it doesn't matter which is real or not, if we look at the composition, we start seeing the mirroring again, right? Think about the shape of the viola da gamba and how it's sort of conforming to the shape of the painter's ear. Much like on the right-hand side, this is from the Kunsthistorisch, this is a Venetian man with a lira da braccio. Notice once again, you can't see both ears, but the musical instrument is the other ear. It's creating that shape for you. In the Garofalo on the left, we also have the folds of his robe sleeves over his instrument of the viola da gamba, right? Which really mimics the other side of his sleeve and how the robe is also folded over his shoulder. Now, what has always bothered me about this self-portrait and why I walked away from it for so long is that technically he's holding the viola da gamba in the wrong hand. Garofalo he is a very well-known musician as well as painter, and he's painted many, many scenes with angels playing the viola da gamba. So why would he get it wrong? That was my question, is this is your self-portrait, this is your calling card. Why would you do something that was so blatantly wrong? And I think I figured it out. I didn't include a slide that explains how I figured it out. Damn it. So basically, we know that a lot of times when you're painting your own self-portrait, well, how would you do it? If you had to paint a portrait of yourself, how would you do it? What's the easiest way for you? Just look in the mirror. He looked in the mirror. That's why the instrument is on the wrong side. But it's not that simple, though, because if you look at the sheet music that's in his hand, the music is in the right way. So how does that work? Why is his instrument opposite, but the actual music scroll is fine? It's something that I, the viewer, can read. Now, I think this is where Garofalo created a musical puzzle. If we look at other paintings by Garofalo, he loved using scrolls and banderoles. And so here I've given you an example. This is a painting in the Hermitage, where on the upper left, I've given you a detail where he draws scrolls and banderoles coming out of the key of St. Peter. Last I checked, my keys don't talk. Right? But he's trying to remind the viewer that the key to Peter, there's a message there. I give thee the keys to my kingdom, right? So here, Garofalo is depicting not actual sound, but perceived and imagined sound. That's why it's the right way. The real world is opposite because it's been reflected in the mirror. But what he's trying to show here, and I know this is quite a jump, I can just send you the PDF of my article, is that he's trying to show you that as the artist, he has control over sound. He can curate it. He can mold it to what he wants it because he has the intellectual capacity and the training to do so. And this is why, if you think about how the scroll is, like, you can't hold anything like that. Like, that posture is not conducive to holding. That's not an actual scroll. And in case you don't recognize it as a self-portrait, because you might be thinking, well, you know, he looks quite different from all the other painters in the studio we've looked at today. Well, yes, he's dressing himself as King David. Does anyone know the story of King David? Saul was very upset, and King David plays music to soothe his soul. Right? So it's that reference again. But I want to end with this. Garofalo, his name in Italian, could also stand in for Garofano, carnation, or gillyflowers. So oftentimes in his paintings, he would include carnations and gillyflowers as like a signature. So if you look on the left-hand side, the Annunciation, what's right in the middle, in the foreground? Carnations. This is his piece by Garofalo. In his famous ceiling, he also, for a long time, I've looked at the ceiling many, many times before. I was like, that's weird. This is painted by Garofalo. He never included his signatures. And I realized, like, oh, no, he did. He's included like 50 bajillion times. And so all the little flower details around the border of the ceiling, they're all carnations. And if you look at his self-portraits again, just as the viola da gamba has like a detail right at the very top, Garofalo has included a carnation right at the very top. He's taken this mirroring to a whole other level. I think that's it for me. I can't remember. No, I probably have one more slide. Go to the next slide. It's supposed to end on Garofalo and Fontana. Okay, it's stuck. Imagine Garofalo's self-portrait and Fontana's self-portrait. Essentially, the takeaway message that I hope I've invited you to think about is that when artists include a musical element into their paintings, they're really inviting you to think about how you can listen to paintings. We also have this in written documents. For example, Duke Guidobaldo had approached Barocci in his studio and said, hey, what are you doing? And Barocci pointed to his canvas and say, I am tuning this music. He actually referenced his painting as music in that he was in the process of tuning it. So I know in the next 2 days we have a lot of conversations about like the different ways that music and art intersects, and I think one really cool way of thinking beyond, you know, what is spatial and what is temporal is to think about how do we meld the senses together, and how has artists, whether they're painters or sculptors, have done it in this sort of like musical puzzle way that brings you to another intellectual level. I will end by saying that I know in the description of the events we talked about like the paragone debate, and while the paragone debates exist in two parts. The second part is that there's a debate of whether painting or sculpture was better, and Leonardo da Vinci always said painting is better because you can like dress really nicely and still do it. But I will say though that before I came here, one of the things I thought about is, well, sculptors can't listen to music while they're doing this. There's the very practical job of like hammering away at things, cutting things, welding. But now that I've like walked around, looked around, I realized that like that's not the case. At the end of the day, sculpture is still art. And so the way that Jeffrey Rubinoff has engaged with music, the way that Garofalo and Fontana, it went to the next slide, has engaged with music, at the end of it really just invites visitors and audiences and participants to think about like the multi-sensory way one truly can engage with the arts. Yeah, so that's it. I actually have another slide, but I'm not going to show it because I don't want to talk about it.
Thank you, Sam, so much for that extremely thought-provoking and engaging and entertaining talk. I'm sure there are questions from the room. Yes, we already have one. Please. Annie?
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was fantastic. And throughout your presentation, I was thinking about how self-portrait also depicts power. This shows the socioeconomic and also gender. So I have a question. Through your research and seeing all these paintings, have you identified instruments or motifs that like signify the socioeconomic or gender of the artist? I was seeing the woman artists playing, I think it's a pianoforte or a piano.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could like...
So thank you for that. So women artists at the time were normally identified with keyboard instruments, specifically the virginal. A lot of people are like, oh, because, virginal, yay. But actually, in my research, I argue that it's a very specific type of virginal, which is a polygonal virginal, which is actually closely related to the arpicordal and relates back to the whole idea of like pastoral poetry. So really reinforcing the point of rhetoric and the oration. But what's interesting is when you hit the 17th century with Artemisia Gentileschi, Judith Leister, they start moving away from the polygonal virginals and you start seeing them with lutes. Leister is not actually playing an instrument. Leister is painting a portrait of a man, supposedly her husband, and he's playing the violin and she's using her paintbrush to tickle his nuts. This is an actual thing. I'm not just saying that to be crass. But so there's different ways of engaging with the musical conversation and thinking about the many, many identities of women.
Yes, Jess, and then Miranda.
I was wondering about, because I know that this happens with comedians, but I was wondering about accessibility, because I don't know much about this time period in terms of art, like what art was being produced and in what ways, but what was being produced and in what ways, but I'm wondering, like, music has a way of transcending knowledge, so people kind of get it, a feeling from it, non-abstract music.
Right.
Right away you're going to get a feeling, even if you know nothing about it typically. Whereas with painting, like, there's a lot going on in these paintings that you really need to understand what you're looking at and have a reference point and all that. So I wonder if sometimes visual artists might aspire to be musicians, or at least be as accessible to many people as musicians are.
I really like your point of accessibility. I do think these self-portraits create different entry points, and these self-portraits were being collected. So there were actual collectors who will write to artists and say, I would like a self-portrait of you for my collection of like 100 self-portraits. This is why there's the Vasari corridor at the Uffizi. And especially for Fontana, we do have primary sources of letters where folks written to her and say, I'm starting a portrait gallery. I would love to hang your portrait right next to Anguissola. And she'll write back and say, oh, I can never be as good as Anguissola, but here I am in a fabulous dress and in front of my desk with statues. And you're like, oh, okay, obviously you're engaging with this whole conversation. This is like your calling card. This is your business card. Does anyone use business cards anymore? But it's something that's very, very strategic, and also there's just so many variations of them. And the fact that Garofalo's self-portrait was later then copied speaks to the fact that, like, I think people recognized sort of like how ingenious these strategies were. I will note that music can be taken in both sides, though. So in Vasari's Lives of the Artists, we have over 36 artists being associated with music. Some of them good, saying, very well trained, very well rounded. Others like did not paint, spent all the time playing the lute and drinking. So there's both sides to it. And if we think about music and art, we also have, the pub scenes and the party scenes. Like those are not as lovely as these. I mean, I think they're just as fun, but they also speak to the different societal perceptions and values.
And then Vanessa.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm sort of curious about a connection between like performance, like physical performance, and like performing identity. And I'm just thinking about, a musician would finish a work and everyone would clap, but then you finish a painting and it's sort of, there's like a moment of like quiet reflection and contemplation, and I guess there's this sort of like wearing this beautiful outfit and like this like obviously like assertion of like your sonic imprint.
Yes.
Rather than like something kind of physical and quiet.
Yeah.
And so I was just curious about what you thought about that.
I've definitely thought a lot about thinking of painting as a continuous performance and indeed a performed art. We do have a lot of records of painters who would paint amongst like an audience. They would be in the room with them, right? But one thing that I also think why painters were really drawn to the music motif is the fact that music, like there's that perception of time associated with it. And I would argue that painting doesn't stop after the painters has put away their brushes. We know pigments change. We know paint darkens over time. Painters were very well aware of this. This is why Da Vinci worked so slowly. But it's this idea of re-emphasizing that there is a perception of time with painting and that it should be carried through. And I think music really re-emphasizes like that. One question I often ask is why instrumental music? Because if we go back to music treatises, composers were regarded much higher than instrumentalists. Instrumentalists were like the lowest of the bunch, which I'm personally very offended. However, instrumentalists allows us to add this element of the senses, right? So not only are you looking at painting, but you're listening to paintings, but you're also feeling painting. I know you're not supposed to rub one's hand up and down in painting when you go to the gallery, but if you're looking at Fontana's hand just right about to touch the keyboard, you also start thinking about the different textures of that, like that moment that's about to happen, right? All of the women artists who painted themselves with musical instruments are playing the music instruments. Versus, if you see woman portraits with instruments, they're usually posing with the instrument, and that's a big difference.
Vanessa.
That leads on to my question, which was, I genuinely don't understand, don't know the relationship between kind of that point in time where we started to collect these various forms of expression into fine arts around the 17th century, I'm guessing. And Shaftesbury starts talking about the aesthetic and them appearing in pictures, whether the artists actually are pushing that trend.
Yes. Well, artists were the best example is Rembrandt, who kept creating these self-portraits and drawings and paintings, not because there was a client waiting for them, but because it was almost like a intellectual exercise, and he was known to like pose in front of the mirror and then draw that. Now, for Fontana, like the group of women artists, they did a lot of that because there's a practicality thing where they looked in the mirror, this was their best model, but it was also the way they could sort of spread their name a little bit, whether or not they were regarded officially as a professional artist or not. So even in the work we're looking at right now with Fontana, she painted multiple copies of this. One was for her husband's family, the other was shared more professionally, etc.
Yes, let's Victoria, and yes, and Craig as well, and then we'll probably finish.
You mentioned several examples of how we see in that period they loved to argue who was better and who was the higher value and who was not. Was there any hierarchy into the musical instruments, like one that was valued the most, one that was considered, like a hierarchy of them?
I think there was quite a bit, and there was also like gendered aspects associated with the instruments. But then, and this is why the instruments that we see in self-portraits, they're quite nice and lovely. But what we see is a good example is Molinaire, because he owned a lot of these musical instruments. You could see the amount of details he included in his own self-portraits versus when he painted, for example, like portrait of a married couple, and he sort of like tones down the instruments. So I think they were very well aware of this.
With this portraiture of the collector's thing, there's this somewhat famous baseball card. It's a portrait of Bob Gibson, a terrifying right-hander who has the glove on the wrong hand.
Oh.
And it became a thing. It became a thing among the collector market. Is this printed backwards? It was a mystery. But sure enough, the cap insignia is the right way. And it was this kind of oddity. And it turns out Bob Gibson is kind of a jokester. So he grabbed his teammate's left-handed glove on photo day and was tired of the whole thing and didn't think anyone knew, wanted to test the photographer if he knew what he was photographing. So he had it on the wrong hand, and it's this kind of this joke. And it kind of, like, do people really know what they're looking at?
Yeah.
Can the experts pick out, I'm the fiercest right-handed thrower ever, or whatever? And so it's this kind of play on this. So
I love that.
Maybe he's testing your expertise of holding this instrument in the proper hand, or maybe it's just a big joke on
I think it's a combination of both. I do think Garofalo is quite a character, especially with his insistence on adding carnations everywhere. It's like, I was here, and here, and here, and here. But I love that baseball card example. I really want to include that in like a future, like as a footnote, by the way.
We're miraculously 1 minute ahead of schedule. Can I just ask one question? You make a very persuasive case that the artists depicting themselves as musicians and with musical instruments is a way to enhance their status and to promote themselves beyond the level of being just manual workers in that sense. Do you see similar evidence of them depicting themselves doing arithmetic or geometry or astronomy, or really is the overwhelming majority of instances of artists doing this with regard to music?
I would say overwhelmingly music, because it's just such a versatile strategy to adopt. But we do have examples of self-portraits, like Fontana has self-portraits of herself in her studiolo writing. Anguissola did the same. So all of them had different variations of this, but music seems to be the one theme that would return. Like, I often call it like theme and variations. Someone does it and they're like, I like it. And they would change it up a little bit and just start seeing over time how it's evolved.
Well, thank you very much, Sam, and let's give her and Vanessa a round of applause.